Hey guys and gals, thanks for joining me for this, my first ever podcast attempt. My name is Danny Tenenfeld, and today I'm going to be joined by the one and only Sage Miller to discuss our views on population growth, climate change, capitalism, and a whole lot more. I apologize for the quality of this recording. This is my first attempt at doing something like this, and I recognize there are a lot of improvements that can still be made. However, if the quality is not too unbearable and you make it through this podcast, I would love to hear y'all's thoughts on what we discussed and any recommendations you have for the future. Just throw those down in the comments section. Thanks again for tuning in and have an amazing day.
Are you still there? You
I
froze? Okay,
am.
cool.
You just cut out a little bit, but I'm still here.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like ever since I guess that module where we talked about fertility and mortality, about how population is actually slowing down, the growth of population is actually slowing down. I mean, we could get into it, but uh, I'm starting to realize that our population is most likely going to curve out around 9 billion. I don't know if you've heard. Whoa, what was that laugh?
It's just a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot, but it's better than the population bomb where it just keeps growing exponentially.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true.
So, are you under the same impression that we're gonna level out about 9 billion, or do you think it's gonna go higher? Do you think it's gonna go lower after a given period of time?
I mean, I think ideally it would go lower, but I think that humans are inherently dumb, and that even though we'll see the negative impacts that we're having as being such a large population and force, we're not going to change anything. So they'll make excuses and they'll be like, but me having 32 kids doesn't change the fact that, stuff like that. So I don't know.
Yeah. So you don't think the population is gonna naturally level out? You think it's just kind of?
I think it will. I do. I think it will. But then I think that people will find a reason for them to be like, but this isn't not for me, or not because of me.
Mm-hmm.
I can do what I want still.
I understand.
You know?
So you think that way, but you also think that the population is going to slow down. Do you think that that's going to happen naturally just by people's choices, or do you think governments are going to get involved, like the whole China one-child policy? And what are your thoughts on that? Was that incredibly inhumane, or was that a semi-intelligent way of approaching this issue, or what?
I think in China it's very different. I think that's a different conversation about their one-child policy, which I don't think is even in effect anymore.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, but I think that the same reasons people are upset about, laws controlling what women can and can't do with their body, it would be the same thing of trying to limit if they can or can't have kids in general. And I think that would be problematic, even though I think it's completely ironic and is essentially the same thing. So I don't know why anyone would be mad, whatever. But yeah, can't have it both ways, So I think that it would have to be by people's own choices. And I think that younger generations kind of understand that. But I think that more religious groups and low-income families are going to be the ones that need that kind of targeted conversation.
Yeah, I get that. Do you think the young less kids sort of a difference in the way society treats having children? Do you think that's going to evolve over the next couple decades, or do you think it's going to kind of follow the same trajectory? What are your thoughts on that?
On how we treat on how what? I'm sorry.
So
I only heard half of that.
Okay, so how younger generations approach having kids. Do you think that people our age and younger are going to have fewer kids than our parents, or it's going to follow the same sort of trajectory? What do you think?
I think maybe. I really just think people are weird and don't follow, they follow patterns, but then they don't. There's certain things that they'll do that their parents did, but then there's other things that they'll do the complete opposite because that's what their parents did. So I think that's like, I don't know how that will relate to having children or not, because I think that's like, that's different. I don't know. I don't, I don't, I mean, I think it's person to person. Like, I know I don't want kids, but I know some of my friends who want to have like 18 children. So it's like, I don't know.
I knew a few girls like that I was growing up with who were just like Southern belles and like, oh, I want to have the most amount of kids. I want to
Yeah,
have
they just
the
want to have
largest
so
one.
many kids. I'm like, nope, not for me.
Special to have all those kids.
Yeah.
All right. So, growing population with bringing underdeveloped nations into sort of the first world, into developed nation status. Um, what do you think? What do you think that's going to look like? Because I think the current trajectory where people get really worried right now, where I'm particularly concerned, is nations like India, where I'm going to get the numbers wrong here, but they have like a billion or 2 billion or something like that population, and a lot of them exist in poverty, and a lot of them exist without these like first world consumer goods. But eventually, we want to bring prosperity to India, and so we're going to have to establish some sort of energy grid, some sort of contact with first world consumerist goods. How do you see that playing out? Do you think that's going to be a long transition? Do you think it's as big of an issue as I'm currently making it, or are you kind of optimistic and see like future engines not being able to mitigate these issues?
Well, I think that in the case of like developing nations and the global south, so many of their problems are from the global north and what we've done. And I think that the global north needs to be responsible for owning up to those things that we've done
Yeah.
and helping aid them so that they can have access to resources that they're going to need. And I think that's going to be problematic because I don't think that a lot of people in the developed world see it as something that's their problem. They think, oh, they think of India or certain
Yeah.
countries in Africa and they're like, aren't going to be concerned about it. Like, I mean, I'm taking it, I think it's a bad thing. I think it's really bad and I'm concerned about it. And I think it needs to be addressed. But I think that we need to aid them more and not do bad things.
So would you be in favor of some sort of coalition or taxation on developed nations, and then use that money to help support these developing nations, or
Yeah,
do
I,
you think
yeah.
they're global?
Um, in my environmental economics course, I wrote my final paper actually about how there needs to be a carbon tax on the global north. And that tax would then go back into sustainable development and resource allocation in the developing world. And that's all hasn't been done. So it's kind of a hypothetical, best case scenario thing. But
Mhm.
if you look at the like numbers and the facts of like how much that would.
So you're supporting a carbon tax on the global north. Do you think it's not a good idea to have a carbon tax for all nations? I mean, granted, because these developing nations, since they don't have the infrastructure, they're not actually producing a lot of emissions. A carbon tax, even on them, in my opinion, wouldn't really halt their development, especially if we're going towards what?
What?
Continue. What was that noise?
No, I was just I made a sound. I I was agreeing with you that putting a carbon tax on like the developing world would be dumb.
Mhm.
If that's what you were saying, I thought that's what you were saying.
It wasn't at all, but anyway. Well, I think the future of technologies is not going to be as heavily carbon based. So I think that that's a really good idea for the short term in accruing some sort of budget that we can allocate to developing nations. Um, but I don't necessarily think that that's the answer in the long run. Maybe that is the answer because not only would we be accumulating this budget that we could use for international aid projects, but it would also help wean some of the technology companies off of carbon, just to make their businesses more profitable. Do you think that would be the case, or do you think these companies are going to just use carbon, pollute carbon, until the day that they're absolutely forced to switch? Where do you see that at?
I think some corporations and companies and businesses are definitely going to be like not willing to do anything until they are forced. But then I think there are other places or other businesses, corporations, what have you, that might be more willing if they see that their economic profit isn't going to plummet. But if they see that their profit's going to, you know, weaken for a while, then they're going to be less inclined to switch to something less carbon dependent.
Are you optimistic about the possibility of us weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels, or do you kind of see it as a slow transition that we have inertia as an economy, and so we're just going to progress forward as we have been? Or because I'm kind of optimistic in this sense where I think the younger generations are growing up with a lot of this environmentalism around them. They're much more aware of these issues, and so once they hold these positions of power, or once they start developing these businesses, they're going to do them in sustainable green ways. However, that might be overly optimistic. I'm not sure what the cost benefit analysis of establishing a business on green fundamentals is. I mean, obviously the cost is the health of the globe, but I just don't know how accessible these sustainable practices and textiles and whatnot are for businesses coming up. Although I'm optimistic, I don't know. Would you consider yourself inherently optimistic or pessimistic
I feel
going
like
forward?
I'm very much a realist. I am an extreme realist. I think that optimism is good to an extent, and I think having some pessimism is good to an extent. Because if you're overly optimistic about change, but then you yourself aren't doing anything, then that's like, why are you optimistic? But then if you're overly pessimistic and also aren't doing anything, then it's just like a, you know, continuous downward spiral. So I think I'm that annoyingly realistic person
Mm-hmm.
that
No, I
just
get it. I get it. That's how people get inspired to enact change. But I don't know. So like if you had to, if you think that optimism or pessimism wasn't going to influence people's actions, people were going to either be sustainable, live sustainably, or live unsustainably, do you think the trajectory of combating climate change is going to be exponential or sort of more linear?
on either end, like on either end of optimism or pessimism, or like, do I think one would lead to more
Not,
exponential changes, or I
not
need you to
necessarily.
rephrase your question.
I I can totally do that. Um, so if you you're gonna impact change. But you see our fight against climate change becoming exponential. So in the next 10 years, everybody gets on board and we start making drastic changes. Or do you think that it will take until like 50 years down the line or 100 years down the line for us to actually have massive change in the industry and consumerist priorities and whatnot?
um, I think that it's not going to take that. I mean, I think it'll take a while, obviously, because people don't like change. Change is inherently a bad thing in the eyes of a lot of people. Uh, But I
That goes
think
along.
what?
I was just saying that goes along with the religious argument. I would assume that.
Yeah, exactly. People don't want to face that kind of change. They don't want to be told that the way they've been living for so long is bad. But if the younger generation is already brought up, like our generation is more in favor of climate science and teaching that to young kids and giving them resources to, know what their future might look like if we don't change things. So I think that's going to be on a continuous trend. And it's going to be an overwhelmingly large amount of the population that even though there is, say, 25% of people on Earth that are like, nah, screw it, I don't care about climate change, they're going to be outweighed by the people that do. So I think
you're right. So it'd be a societal pressure that sort of helps impact that change.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on globalization. This is something that I've gone back and forth with a million times, and I know I should probably let you answer first, but let me just give you sort of my 2 cents where I'm currently standing on globalization.
Oh, please do.
I don't know if that's sarcasm or not, but
it wasn't. It was really genuine.
anyway, so I think globalization is definitely a force. It sort of breaks down barriers. I would like to think it makes people, there's no boundaries on where you can go in this world. I believe that you should be able to explore and interact with cultures all over the world to get the most informed perspective. However, I think with our current dependence on fossil fuels and what that means for transportation, um, uh, globalization is actually kind of a bad thing right now. So what I mean by that is when we have open trade with, let's say, China or a developed country like that, that's a lot of pollution just in the transportation of cargo ships and flying over of goods and resources. And, and so my current thoughts on globalization are that it will ultimately be the best option. But first, we need to create sustainable energy for sustainable transportation because I think currently globalization leads to a lot of carbon pollution. And what I learned in another class was that even when we cap emissions on countries, the transportation of like cargo ships and whatnot, the pollution that those ships are actually emitting are not accountable to any certain nation. So whether it's the importer or exporter, neither of those nations are responsible for that pollution. So I guess, what are your thoughts on globalization? Do you think that it's ultimately detrimental to the environment? Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it's a bad idea? Do you think we should have sort of these closed barriers and trade caps and whatnot? Or what are your thoughts?
I don't really like the concept of globalization. I think it's talked about in such a positive way that we're able to, spread cultural ideas and resources and all this stuff, but that's not really what it's turned into. It's more of like, you don't spread cultural ideas. There's one culture that dominates and then implements all of their quote unquote like superior ways into another culture. And I think that's what globalization has turned into. And I think that leads to why there's so much like negative parts of what's come out of globalization, like what you were saying with how much pollution comes from trading with, a bunch of other countries that requires us to go across seas and use airplanes and boats or whatever it may be, that it's not allowing us to focus on like in your own home, in your own country, in your own place, and then it grow the local businesses or companies that are there that might be doing things more sustainably and more ethically. And I think globalization has kind of taken away from the whole like think local mindset that some places are now trying to like bring back because they see that it is better. But I also think that globalization in the right sense can be good of us sharing what we've learned and what we know with other places and then sharing like what they have and what they know with us. But I think that it's hard to say in the United States that we want the same things that someone in South America or even some places in Africa would want. You know, it's not, that's not a great approach to it, I think.
So my interpretation of what you just said is, if done correctly, it can be a force for good, but it hasn't historically turned out that way. Kind of like, I guess, the idea of socialism, where we want to help out the poor, we want to make sure everybody has equal opportunity, but socialism has historically turned into some really horrible tragedies, I guess. I kind of completely agree with you. So this is kind of completely off topic, but I kind of want to just spread the word on this, get people's feelings on this topic, but space mining. So I'm a huge supporter of Elon Musk.
Oh my gosh, I have to tell you this really quick. It's terrifying.
I guess that's a good topic. Do you think, well, I would say it's obvious that electric cars are the future. Is there any reason to describe that?
They're great. I think that some of the metals that they use aren't. And I think that's the future problem, is how are they mining for these kinds of technologies? But I don't know enough about that to even say anything. So.
And he has talked about exploiting comets, asteroids, whatever comes around our orbit, and actually mining precious metals off of these things. Do you think that this is viable? Do you think this is something that we're going to see in our lifetimes?
I have no idea. I can't even comprehend that. Like, I can't fathom someone. I mean, I can imagine someone doing that, but it sounds like a weird space movie that's done like all futuristic and stuff. But that is, I guess, what might. I mean, yeah, it could happen. I don't know if
the future's now. You know how much weird stuff we have right now
that me sitting in the Tesla was just, I felt like freaking George Jetson. It's like, this is not okay. But yeah, I think that it could happen. I think it would terrify me, and I think there's a lot of things that could go wrong. But I mean, whatever. What do I know?
Well, all right. So if you hadn't really considered this idea previously, where would you have assumed we get resources? Do you think we continuously extract from the earth on like an infinite time, getting rid of mountaintops and whatnot? Because I don't see a good alternative.
No, I don't think there's a good alternative unless we really figure out a way to recycle and reuse those kinds of precious metals and stuff. But I don't, like I said, I really don't know enough about any of that to even speak to it in a way that would be of meaning, or of me just saying like, I think this and it's wrong, you know, like.
This is a platform for fleshing out ideas.
Yeah.
So in one of our modules, we're talking about urbanization and how if we really wanted to sort of have the like land ethic where we are able to use resources, but we have the ecosystem's health in mind, it kind of seems like urbanization and getting people to move to these urban areas is kind of key for sustainability going forward, especially if our populations keep growing. First of all, do you think that that's necessary? And I have a bunch of follow-up questions on urban landscapes, but do you see that being the future of housing and whatnot? Is these urban settings that get built up and we have these protected areas, or do you think people are kind of going to be sprawled out like they have been historically? Do you think it's necessary to create these massive urban societies?
Um, I think that it's how things are going.
But not necessary?
I don't know. I think it is necessary. I think that going into a more urbanized popular in a shift to more urbanization and stuff like that is going to become necessary, where people are all living in a more centralized cluster where you don't need cars and it relies on public transportation, and we're not spreading out as much, which means we're not damaging the land as much, grow higher but not wider. We used to say that in one
Yeah.
of my other classes I took. But I think that also has other unforeseen problems.
Well, let's
But
talk about that. What problems do you see? For example, I think there might be a detachment from nature if we sort of uh,
yeah,
become more urbanized and we don't get out into nature.
I
What are
think
your thoughts?
I think that's potential, and I think there's certain, because we're still going to be in the way of nature. Like, we are always going to be in the way of nature, and if we are so centralized in one area, that could affect how, I don't know, birds migrate from place to place, or other animals, or what have you. Um, or we're so detached that we don't care about what's happening to those animals. Like, one of the modules that we did was about like wolves, and I love wolves. They're one of my favorite animals, and I understand that they cause economic problems for ranchers and farmers, but they were there before us, and they should be respected because they were there before us, and they're not doing this because they're malicious and bad and evil and hate farmers. They don't
Mhm.
know any better. you know they see
Yeah.
a animal that's like, hey, that's something I could eat, they're going to do it. And that's our fault for putting our livelihood and stuff in their way. So I think that we tend to blame nature and everything in nature instead of ourselves for being like, hey, maybe we should move this somewhere else. Or we don't do that. We change what we depend on, and that might not have anything to do with urbanization. That could be something completely different, but it just is made me think about it.
So that's an interesting point that I've actually been thinking about a lot recently is the place of us amongst nature and the animals and the importance and significance of apex predators. Because I completely agree with the sentiment that nature is kind of sacred and we shouldn't kill off species just for our own benefit. However, if you look, I don't know. I know from old cultures and cultures who don't have the access to security that we do. Something like living up in Alaska, where they have bears around. Bears have no problems eating humans. They're kind of like, if you want to look at them like they're monsters. Like they can eat their children. Do
What?
we want?
Like grizzly bears. Black bears are babies. Black bears won't do anything. Anyway, sorry.
Okay. No. Well, that's a good point. So, do you think that we should protect black bears over the grizzly bears and polar bears that look at
No.
humans that as snacks? No. You think we should protect all of them equally?
Yeah.
Okay.
I still think we're invading them, and they are reacting in a defensive way, and we see it as them being monsters and aggressive, when it's the same thing when someone comes into your home with a gun, a knife, whatever. What are you going to do? You're not just going to sit there and be like, well, this is it, you know? So I
No.
think that we treat them as though they're stupid, dumb, and not. And I mean, yeah, obviously animals are not at the same level of intelligence, whatever. But
Well,
I
I don't
think
know if
that
it's.
they're still, I think people treat them as if they don't,
Uh,
like, they haven't been alive for, you know, centuries and centuries.
I yeah.
So,
I totally understand that sentiment. I would just put forth to you something that I gleaned off of the Joe Rogan podcast. I'm sure anybody who's listening has heard of the Joe Rogan podcast. But he presents this idea of, would you want to be worried about getting attacked and eaten by wolves if we don't regulate their population? Like going out to your car at night, if you want to go to the grocery store, do you want to have that stress of potentially being eaten by wolves or your family members being eaten by wolves? Or is that just like a consequence of letting biodiversity flourish?
Well, I think that comes down to us harming their food population, like us taking down moose populations, which is one of their main sources of that's what they eat. So when we take those things away, then yeah, they're gonna come after us. So I don't necessarily like that argument of like, oh well, if I want to go do this, it's like then don't harm their own well-being. I mean, yeah, obviously that would be the worst case scenario, that we do have to be wary of that happening. But to me, it's still the same thing of like, you go into any public place, you have a risk of being shot and killed because guns aren't being regulated. So I think that there's no difference to me.
That's a
But
whole other topic.
I'm an extremist. So what do I know?
Yeah. Well, no, I value your opinion. So throughout this class, we've talked a lot about sort of, well, the political economy perspective and how it views capitalism and whatnot. Would you consider yourself more of a capitalist or, I guess, a political economist or Marxist, whatever they're called?
I don't know. I don't even know if I have a good answer. I don't know. I have my issues with all of them.
Sure. Yeah. You think there's no good balance being struck?
I just think that people have become so dependent on this idea of capitalism and like, oh, capitalism's so great and all these things, and then they reject anything else, you can't even have a conversation with people that are like that about, hey, maybe a different approach would be better, because they're so hell-bent on this one way of doing things and so it's like
So
I don't
all right.
know.
So let me phrase it like, do you think it's possible to have efficient innovation without capitalism? Do you think we could have sort of like a socialist economy and still innovate on the same scale?
I think so, because I think people are going to innovate and change and do things and create no matter what. I don't think they need a capitalist model to do that. I don't think.
You don't think there's incentives through the capitalist model?
No, I think that's one of the biggest arguments for capitalism, is like, oh, if there's no capitalism, people aren't going to be motivated to do things. And I think that's wrong, because what did people do, before capitalism? They changed, they did stuff themselves, and they didn't have that. They didn't have that motivation, because people are going to do that no matter what. And yeah, some people might not, but that's their own personal, they don't care. They're like, well, why should I? But then there's going to be the people that are, no matter what, I want to do this, I'm going to do this. I don't care what the gain or the fallout is. So I think that capitalism is a way to convince perhaps lazier people that they are to motivate themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you don't think it would have any impact on innovation, or do you think there would be a minor impact?
I think there might be a minor impact at first, because people will be upset and they'll be angry, and then they'll just like fume in their anger for a while. But I think eventually they'd be like, well, time to go do something else.
Yeah.
But
okay. I kind of agree. I think that people want to make a difference inherently in their life, give their life meaning, and so there will be innovation. I do think that capitalism and sort of the competition that comes along with capitalism kind of helps expedite the process, but also capitalism is creating all these problems of inequality and whatnot. And so Yeah,
Hmm.
I'm kind of with you where I think the political economy perspective is the best approach, at least to like self-analyze, to self-audit your practices. Um, but I do think that there's some value in capitalism. But I don't know. Maybe humans are evolving. Maybe we don't need to fall into either one of those two categories. But all right, I'm gonna finish this off with a question I know is a massive question, and I don't want to put you on the spot like this, but
Oh, put me on the spot.
how do we
I'm
make,
ready.
let's do it. How do we make society more, or how do we make society sustainable the quickest? Do we, so this goes back to a couple of our modules. Do we need to implement some sort of institution, third-party institution? Do you think we need the government to step in and fulfill that role? Do you think there should be a global body that should be responsible? Um, uh, I can give my thoughts after, but I'm just curious as to what you think is the most efficient way moving forward to create a global sustainable society.
Mm.
Said you were ready for
I wasn't ready for that. I didn't know what you were going to ask. I spoke too early.
it.
Um,
Take your time. We have
um,
all. If you were put in charge, if you were the president of Earth,
oh, okay.
what do you think would be the best or the quickest way to make Earth sustainable?
The quickest way to make Earth sustainable. Gosh, I don't know. I think people are so dumb. Um, I think that there would probably have to be some institutional changes. I really think that education needs to be the first and primary
Mm.
step. I think everyone needs to be educated, and that goes to not just focusing on like the developed world and the inadequate education systems that are here, but I think really focusing on education in poverty-stricken areas, educating especially younger girls, because when they are educated, they are able to come out of poverty. They have less kids. They're more like involved in society. And then when people are not worried about, if people have access to, clean water, food, shelter, more economic like profits, that's when they can focus on the environment and more long-term goals, and not just, I need to worry about how I'm going to make it through tomorrow. I can't be concerned about the environment in 10 years, I think that's I think
Mm-hmm.
that's really a big first step, and I think that would be really hard to do. Um, and I think that's a very long
So
term process, but I think that would be that would be my step one. Is
step one as president of Earth.
step one is president versus education. Step two is carbon tax. I come back to my carbon tax.
Yeah, no. One should be sort of bringing these nations out of extreme poverty. Like, am I hearing you correctly in that you think that we should sort of redistribute wealth so that people can focus their priorities on environmental issues, or?
Yeah, and I think that there needs to be an equal distribution of wealth. Honestly, I think that we need to have no more lower, middle, and upper class. I know this is going to be extreme, so just go with me for a second.
No,
Just
no,
flow
I
with
love
it.
it. I love it.
If there was a completely equal distribution of wealth, this is a very socialist ideal,
Yeah.
and there's no more goals to become that wealthiest 1%, which the wealthiest 1% could bring everyone out of poverty and still be billionaires. So think about that for a second. We get rid of them, not get rid of them, don't kill them, but they're able to redistribute their wealth to everyone else in the world and fix changes. And then they'll still be the upper class, but there won't be that huge barrier. You know how the middle class is disappearing. Everyone's either you're now lower class or you're upper class. The middle class has completely gone away. So I think that if that shifted back to more people being more people being in all the same playing field, then that would be a good thing, and that would change how people are able to focus on the environment, because they're not going to be focused on becoming the next billionaire, because it's not even a tangible thing anymore, if that makes sense. And that, as I'm saying all of it, it sounds kind of dumb and radical, but I also think that in a way it would be a good thing.
So let me just pose this to you and play devil's avocado. Do you think that giving these poor nations, poor communities, financial resources through the redistribution from billionaires and whatnot, do you think that there would be any sort of negative impact now that they have this buying power? They would want to invest in some of the Western technologies and whatnot, and that would ramp up the current productions, which are currently polluting a lot. Do you think there would be any sort of like spike in environmental degradation if the first step of take is redistribution of wealth?
I think initially there might be, because when people become even the slightest bit more wealthy, the first thing they will consume is more meat. And I think that, yeah, that will be a strike increase maybe in the amount of meat consumed initially. But I don't think, and I could be completely wrong, I don't think that would be a long-term impact, if you will, because I think that maybe there might be problems associated with that obviously I'm not thinking about those, because I think that is like a real concern, I guess, that could be there, is what would they choose to do if they were slightly growing into a more wealthy population. But I think they're so rooted in their fundamental, family ties and values and things like that, that would still be at the priority for them, just because of that's how it's been there for so long.
So
but I could be very wrong.
Think that would transform? Yeah. So my idea is that Western civilization has kind of grown detached from family ethics and environmental ethics and whatnot, because we've created these sort of artificial realities where we're always on our phone, always online, always in buildings and whatnot. My fear is that I understand your optimism that they would continue to have their cultural ideals and norms, but just have more resources in order to protect them and survive and whatnot. My only concern would be that it would actually change their priorities and change the way they live their lives, and it become more westernized, and that could potentially do horrible things to the environment just through a massive new consumerist society. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying I'm right. I think I like where your head's at. I do think that we need a lot more innovation in green technologies, in green products and whatnot, for that transition to not be drastic. But I don't know. I do tend to agree that these cultures need more financial resources. They need to not be worried about survival as much, and maybe then we would have a whole new workforce for creating green infrastructure and innovation moving forward. But yeah, no. All right. So I know I said last question, but what ways has your perspective evolved at all through information that we've gleaned through this class? And I know it's putting you on the spot, and if you don't have a good answer, I can cut it out. So
you might have to cut cut it out anyway because my laptop is angry with me and just dropped from 43% to 11. So just bear with me if it dies. I don't know what happened.
Just final words.
Final
I know
thoughts.
you said you're a realist. It kind of sounded like you had some optimistic perspectives in there.
I do have optimistic perspectives, but I'm not overtly optimistic.
Okay, I think that's healthy.
Thanks.
So yeah, just ways that your perception has changed at all through the information that we've gathered over the past 2 months.
Has it been 2 months? Oh Lord.
I don't know.
I think. What do I think? I don't know. I guess since I was not I didn't know like wasn't like knowledgeable about some of this stuff, but it didn't take a lot to convince me that this was a real problem. I already knew that these things were bad. So I think that it was easier for me to go through this class being like in agreement with like a lot of things that we looked at because I already was like, yeah, there are problems and we need to address those. But I think that some of the things that we went through that were more interesting or changed how I thought about some things were perhaps some of the economic, like the political economy and things like that, and how we think about those types of things, because I'm not super economically I'm not necessarily aware, but I don't think about the economy and everything that I do because that's not what I study. That's not necessarily what I care about. But I think that's what's changed in this course, and especially one of the courses I took last semester that's been like, well, if you don't have backing from the economy, or if you don't think there's going to be economic gain, then people are not going to be willing to listen, talk, change, or whatever. So I think that's been my biggest change in perception about how I think about population, natural resources, economic growth, and sustainability, and all of that stuff, is incorporating it into a more economic mindset.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, yeah, I think that's very valid, and I appreciate that insight. I would just say that my perspective, I might just cut this out, but it has become a lot more optimistic, just because I now kind of fully understand population dynamics, and I'm no longer concerned about an exploding society. And I think that if we have a cap society, and if we have the sustainably minded generations coming up, that things are gonna turn out well. But I appreciate you so much for doing this, Miss Sage. And have a lovely rest of your day, and I shall talk to you soon.